opening to thank Seisun Roshi for the opportunity of giving a talk. I guess that was the prompt. For those of you who are new, she's the abbot of Sweetwater Zen Center and the original founding person. And so I want to thank her for the opportunity to give a talk. And what I'd like to do is follow along on some comments that Seisun made last week and also Choa. So everybody knows who Choa is now. Who's new? Choa, raise your hand. And he gave some talks in the recent retreat around mistakes, making mistakes. I did not get to hear any of his talks, but I did hear the closing circle in which people shared about their experience with mistakes. So I'm going to use a very, very famous quotation from something called the Genjo Koan by a person named Dogen Zenji to kind of share a little bit following on the coattails of Seisun's talk and Choa's comments about mistakes. And so those of us who aren't familiar, Dogen Zenji is really the founder of Japanese Soto Zen, which is one of our dominant lineages, in a way our dominant lineage in our white plum lineage of Japanese Zen. And he lived between 1200 and 1253, and is really revered for not only his understanding, but his lyricism, the way he wrote, the way he expressed himself. So he's kind of the patron saint of our lineage of Japanese Zen. And I was thinking about it this morning. Maizumi Roshi, who is the founder of White Plum, he really talked a lot. He shared a lot from Dogen, really more than anybody else, more than even talking about what the Buddha said. He revered Dogen. So I just want to share this phrase with you and then just make a few comments that I hope will be of value. And again, this, for those of you who have been around, this will be very familiar. For those of you who are new, maybe not so, but it's a kind of a very famous section of this, one of the fascicles that Dogen Zenji wrote in his lifetime of in something called the Shobogenzo, and this is from the Genjo Koan. To study the Buddha way is to study oneself. To study oneself is to forget oneself. To forget oneself is to be enlightened by the 10,000 dharmas. To be enlightened by the 10,000 dharmas is to be freed from one's body and mind and those of others. No trace of enlightenment remains, and this traceless enlightenment is manifested completely. So that the kind of parts that I want to focus on, and like I said, kind of following on Seisun's comments and Choa's comments, are really the first two lines. To study the Buddha way is to study oneself. And it's said very often, and certainly in my experience, that often we come into practice really wanting to skip over and get to the forget the self part. We're kind of sick of focusing on ourselves, and we're looking to be liberated from this very limited sense of who I am, which is exactly what practice is about, is to be liberated from this confined sense of who we are. As I heard Maizumi Roshi say, appreciate yourself, not the way you're used to thinking of yourself. So, what I wanted to comment on, what follow on Seisun's comment, was she said something to the effect of, we never get outside of the conditioning of ourselves. Always trying to, some of us maybe, myself, I'll just say, we're trying to fix our conditioning. We're trying to get better. We're trying to get outside of these ways that are habitual patterns of mind or our beliefs about ourselves, about the way the world is. And we kind of can feel like somehow I'm going to get it all together and get outside of this conditioning of the self. But we do it within the same box of identifying with ourselves. And, it seems to me that that never really happens. That as a human being, things come up. And I was tell you about there's a book that we're reading in our sitting group here in Idlewild. And the title of it is Enlightenment is an Accident, Ancient Wisdoms and Simple Practices to Make You More Accident Prone. And it's by a guy named Tim Burkett, who practiced originally with Suzuki Roshi and had transmission with Katagiri Roshi. And he has this quote in the beginning from Suzuki Roshi: "When you try to understand everything, you will not understand anything. The best way is to understand yourself, and then you will understand everything." And then Tim Burkett says, if this book leaves you with only one takeaway, I hope it is this: the path to enlightenment leads directly through our broken places. So that's kind of what I really want to emphasize of what, when Seisen was talking about not getting outside of the conditioning of the box of self. And this very first line from Dogen, to study the Buddha ways, to study oneself. And really be willing to look at all these aspects of ourselves that come up, that we don't like, that we identify with, and really be willing to be with them. I mean, the whole practice of Zen is really be with what's happening. And that there isn't anything outside of ourselves to acquire. Over and over and over again, we get directed back to here, right now, as this. But what practice does do, in my experience, is it gives us the confidence and the capacity to stay with what's happening, because that's kind of what we're lacking in some ways. Seisen talked about the Four Noble Truths last time, and she, what the Buddha said, why we suffer is because of clinging and aversion. And that relates directly with how do we stay with what's happening. If I want to hold on to something that's impermanent, or I want to push away what I don't like, and I suffer in either of those ways because stuff changes. And some stuff doesn't feel like it changes that much. And that's what I was kind of mentioning about the conditioning. I'm not going to get outside of the box of being valveless. In the relative form, that's who I am. And I have my history, and I have my experiences, and I have my tendencies and personality. And there's nothing wrong with any of that. There's nothing inherently wrong with any of us. And enlightenment, I don't know. I just tell you what I've understood and what I hear and what I study and what I'm told by my teacher, is that enlightenment is realizing that we're whole and complete as we are. And hooking on to Choa's talking about mistakes, I think the biggest mistake we make is thinking that we're not whole and complete as we are, that somehow we're a mistake. And from what I understand from a psychological perspective, that's what shame is thinking that we're a mistake. And I don't know about other cultures because I've only really ever lived in this one, and I grew up as an American. But it seems a very, very much something that we, maybe in the West, but in the States, seem to, because I've talked to a lot of people, and I've talked to a lot of people in the interview, and I've talked to a lot of people in my life in general, and I've talked to myself a lot. And the sense of inadequacy, of not being enough, of being defective in some way, seems very much part of our experience. And it's a false belief. It's exactly what the Buddha said will cause us to suffer, is thinking that we're not whole and complete as we are. And that's why I was just, when I was thinking about, I don't know what Shoei talked about mistakes. And I'm sure it was many other dimensions of them. But I think over and over and over again, we make this fundamental mistake of thinking that we're not whole and complete as we are. So the flip side of that, though, is the study the self side, which is really becoming intimate with who we are. And one of the things Tim Burkett talks about in his book a lot is experiencing the shadow, experiencing stuff we don't like about ourselves. I had an experience recently where somebody I would consider to be a close friend, certainly almost an extended family, sent me an email in which he was very, very unhappy with my behavior, to the point of not wanting to talk to me anymore. And one of my first, well, besides the fact that I was hurt and kind of angry because I felt like a lot of things were inaccurate. But in terms of my identity, it was like, but I'm so lovable. How could anybody feel this way about me? And my idea of myself was really challenged, which had nothing to do with the content of what he was expressing. It was my identity of myself. Which, of course, prevents me from actually taking the information for whatever validity it had. And actually, to be honest, what was really liberating about that was to realize, okay, if everybody doesn't like me, I can let go of the idea that Valvalez is so lovable that nobody would not like her. And having lived in a small town for 36 years, there's a sense of shame that, oh, people would know there's somebody here that doesn't like me. All of which is just basically very self-involved. So the aspect of kindness towards ourselves, in a way, what enabled me to take that, to take that information in from the email was, I can still be friendly and kind towards myself, even though this person isn't liking me right now. And right now, the phase that I'm in right now, I cannot emphasize enough how to study the self, bringing in the friendliness and self-compassion seems so essential to really go deep into being intimate with ourselves. In a way, I don't know how else we do it. Because shit comes up. Sorry, excuse me. But it does. And actually, in a way, the more you settle down and practice, the more stuff that's been hidden can come up, which feels very uncomfortable. It's like, this isn't what I was expecting. But to actually stay with it and, allow some of those shadow parts of ourselves to be revealed to ourselves, I think takes compassion towards ourselves too. And so I really want to emphasize that, especially for those of you you may not just be starting out in practice. It may just be that you're new coming to Sweetwater. But I really, really encourage you to trust that you're whole and complete as you are, and trust the practice of looking inward, and also trust being kind and friendly towards yourself in that process. So in terms of the second line, to study oneself is to forget oneself. I just kind of wanted to share a little anecdote with you. Somebody had told me about this podcast. I don't know if any of you have listened to it. It's called The Emerald. And basically the person was talking about animatedness, and that even inanimate objects are animate and have life. And so I was listening to this. I had to go to this workshop off the hill, away from Idlewild, and I had a long drive, a 2-hour drive back. And I was listening to this podcast, and as I was coming back up the hill, as we call it here, I passed a place that I've passed, I don't know, hundreds of times driving home, called Lake Fulmore. And it's a sweet little spot. So I decided to stop. So I was listening to this whole thing about everything is alive. And so I took a walk around Lake Fulmore, and I was so amazed that having this kind of invitation to really see the aliveness of the world, the trees, the light through the trees, the reeds in the lake, the fishermen, everything felt so alive. And the reason I mention this is because it is in my experience, and I'm sure it's in yours as well, that when we can sort of be less preoccupied with ourselves, the world lights up. We see the aliveness of the world in a different kind of way, because we're not so preoccupied with what's going on here. And to me, that's a simple way to say to study oneself is to forget oneself. Both are happening simultaneously. And what struck me in reading this, a few times over in preparation for this talk, is that I thought this is a linear thing. To study Buddhism is to study the self, to study the self is to forget the self, to forget the self is to be, enlightened by the 10,000 things. To be enlightened by the 10,000 things is to drop off body and mind and the body and mind of others. And this manifestation goes on forever. And reading it, and it's pretty obvious, it goes on and on and on. It's a spiral. It's not a line. And sometimes we're in the place of really studying the self, and then things open up and then something else comes up and we study the self again. And then, there can be the time where we're just enlightened by the 10,000 things and there isn't subject-object relationship anymore. And we see through that. I guess that's what Yasutani Roshi said about the Genjo Koan. Genjo Koan means that the subjective realm and the objective realm, the self and all things in the universe, are nothing but Buddha Dharma itself. So nothing but the source, the groundless source. So I guess I'll just say it again to close, which is that I really encourage all of us to be intimate with ourselves and to use whatever resources we need to kind of stay with our experience, which isn't always just sitting through it, but really trusting deeply that this is the way how it seems to me anyway, is that all the way in takes us all the way out. And there isn't anything more precious than your experience exactly as it is.